or on the WebEx. Okay.
So if everyone's ready, we'll begin. So good morning or good evening or good afternoon, depending on where our audience is sitting. I'm Professor Karen Bucker from the University of British Columbia, and I'm one of the two moderators of this session. And the other moderator is Dr. Marwa Al-Kabani. Marwa, I'd love you to introduce yourself before I introduce the rest of the panelists briefly.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Marwa Al-Kabani, Associate Advisor at UAE Federal Competitiveness and Statistics Center. Thank you, Karen.
So today our session is going to be focusing on probably one of the most critical topics with which we could engage at this conference, and that is a digital ecosystem for Earth and the Sustainable Development Goals, which we'll be referring to throughout this session as the SDGs. So this topic obviously brings together two of the most profound challenges of our era, that is, a digital transformation and Earth governance. And we've got an amazing group of panelists here to address this theme, focusing on the question of how open data can be deployed to address critical environmental sustainability challenges. So we're really going to drill down into how open data can be mobilized to support the creation of digital public goods for the environment and bring together voices from scientists, government, private companies, and also hopefully really debating how this ecosystem can also include non-traditional data producers, citizen scientists, and others who are playing such an important role in environmental data collection. We have two themes. The first is open data and the SDGs. The second is data governance. And as you'll see, we're going to be having a very lively dialogue with our speakers around questions pertaining to these themes. Before we begin, I'll briefly introduce our panelists. So I'll begin with Eliane Ubalijoro. Dr. Ubalijoro is the Executive Director of Sustainability in the Digital Age and the Global Hub Director in Canada for Future Earth, with decades of experience spanning academia, science policy, and the international development sectors. And she's also closely associated with McGill and Concordia universities in Canada. Welcome, Eliane. His Excellency Mohammed Hassan is the Executive Director of the Data and Statistics Sector at the Federal Competitiveness and Statistics Center since 2015 in the United Arab Emirates. So he has also held positions including the Corporate Communication and External Affairs Department in the Emirates Competitiveness Council in the Minister of State Office. Welcome, His Excellency. Next, we have Dr. R.G. Cavada, who serves a dual role, Manager of the Earth Sciences Division of Sustainable Development Goals activities in support of the SDGs, while also leading Booz Allen Hamilton's project on studies, assessments, and strategic management for the Applied Sciences program in NASA's Earth Science Division. Welcome, Dr. Cavada. David Jensen, the coordinator of the Digital Transformational Task Force at UNEP. He is the person actually responsible, I think, for creating a lot of the networks that brought us all here today. In addition to many other hats he wears, he's also currently serving as UNEP's focal point in the Coalition for Digital Environmental Sustainability within the Secretary General's Digital Cooperation Roadmap. Welcome, David. And then Andrew Zolli works at one of my favorite companies. I'm not supposed to be partial, but I think Planet is doing fairly amazing work. I know, Andrew, you oversee global impact initiatives at Planet, working to ensure that the company's data, products, and services achieve their highest humanitarian, sustainable development, and scientific potential. So obviously a close fit with the SDGs. Welcome, Andrew. So with that, Marwa, have I forgotten anyone? That was my list before we move into questions.
No, you're perfect.
Wonderful. So let's dive into the discussion and we'll begin with David. So David, considering our first theme of open data and the SDGs, we'd love to hear from you about some of the challenges, how to plug the global environmental data gaps with non-traditional sources of data, including Earth observation and citizen science, but also ensuring how that data is and the analytics are going to be flowing through the apps and the platforms of the digital economy to drive the changes we need to see in economic incentives and human behaviors. Within that, Is there any role the UN should and could play? Love to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Karen. Can you just give me a thumbs up as well if you can hear me? Excellent, because I switched microphones before our prep. So let me talk about that first question about the data gaps we currently see. And I just wanted to touch very briefly on what those data gaps actually are. So I think there's three gaps we need to be thinking about. The first gap is a gap in coverage, right? At the moment, if you look at sort of the global view, how many of the environmental SDG indicators can we actually monitor? It's only around 40%. So we've got this 60% gap in terms of simply monitoring global progress against the environmental SDGs. So national reporting at the moment is patchy, it's inconsistent, it's not totally interoperable, and it's not aggregating into that global level view. So there's a coverage gap. The second gap we have, I call it a timeliness gap. Basically, if you look at how long it's taking the global community to actually measure progress against some of our big agreements like Paris Agreement or Biodiversity Agreement, the stock-taking exercise, the stock-taking process takes about 4 to 5 years, right? That's a long period of time in order to understand effectiveness of the convention. So we've got this timeliness gap. We're not getting the kind of data to measure effectiveness fast enough to really inform policy. So we're not sort of creating that feedback loop on what effective policy is looking like. And the final gap is really a question of stakeholder data. Non-state actors, companies and citizens are not necessarily also sharing the progress they're making in a systematic way in terms of national progress. So there's a big gap in terms of how companies and how stakeholders and how citizens can actually share their data and disclose some of their data on their progress. So those are the three key gaps we need to start filling. And obviously Earth observation data is excellent because it achieves a number of things, right? You've got global level coverage, you've got a consistent way of doing the coverage, and you've got a very timely amount of data. Data is available either daily or weekly or bi-weekly or monthly, but you've got the timeliness factor sorted out. So this can be, an incredible source of data to plug some of these gaps. If you look across the SDGs, there's 169 targets, and around 71 of them can actually be monitored with Earth observation data. That's about 42%. So the opportunity is huge. And we're already seeing how some of this data is being used to monitor some of the SDG indicators. So for example, SDG 661 on the spatial extent of water is now an indicator where Earth observation data is being used to create that global level view. And then it's being used by countries. If they have no national data, they're pulling down that global data set and using it in lieu of national data. So you can already see big transformations happening in the way this data is being used. Now, the other solution that we see is citizen science data, right? Citizens collecting data and feeding that in. And we're also seeing some of the SDGs starting to take into account citizen science information. If you look at SDG 14.11b on plastic debris density, the methodology for that does actually include an entire citizen science data feed for looking at beach debris. So beach cleanup and beach monitoring is actually a part of the data sets that are feeding into that indicator. So we're seeing these technologies and these being used. I think the key thing or the key barrier that's preventing the further acceleration of the adoption of these technologies is trust in the data, right? Is trust in the data, trust in the analytics, and it's transparency in how they're being used and how they're being formulated. So I think part of the challenge is a technical one, but part is also sort of a human one, right? How do we ensure we co-design these processes and these analytics to build trust in them as we go? Now, the final part of your question is like, how do we ensure, once we have the data, how do we ensure that it starts to flow into the digital economy to begin to influence behaviors and begin to influence incentives? And that's a fundamental part of this. I think in that sense, obviously, we need a whole set of global standards to ensure the data is interoperable and quality. And we need to begin to look at, what are the things we're actually trying to shift by using digital technologies to accelerate environmental sustainability.